Okay, we're live on YouTube. I think we're live on Twitch too. Oh boy. I haven't done this in a while. Gonna have a philosophical discussion with Claude on the subject of freedom of speech. Yeah, it's kind of an intense day. I'm gonna start this off by having opening a discussion with Claude. Okay, so like I said, today is an intense day. Political conservative Charlie Kirk was shot and killed today at an event that he typically does. He has a tour and a plan. What he does is he goes to various school campuses and he attempts to open dialogue with the students on campus and whoever is part of the community there. And he was at an event today and having a dialogue and talking to people. And he was shot and subsequently killed. And I wanted to have a discussion around freedom of speech and the dangers, the perils, and the virtues and the positives that go along with it. So I'm interested to hear from you, Claude, your thoughts on the validity of freedom of speech as a human right, and what are, in your opinion, the limits of that, and to what lengths should we go to protect freedom of speech. And I want to have a debate with you about this and talk about some of those gray areas that could be a little bit scary and uncomfortable in light of what happened today. Okay, so processing that, and then I'm going to enter. So okay. Okay, so some interesting things are coming. Let's hear what Claude has to say. Okay, here we go.
I need to search for information about this reported incident, as this would be significant breaking news that I should verify before discussing it. This is indeed a tragic and significant news event. Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA and a prominent right-wing activist, was shot and killed on Wednesday while addressing students at Utah Valley University during a stop on his American Comeback Tour. A person of interest in the fatal shooting is now in custody, FBI Director Kash Patel said. This tragic incident brings into sharp focus the complex relationship between free speech, political discourse, and public safety. I'm happy to discuss the philosophical and practical dimensions of free speech with you. Freedom of speech is foundational to democratic society. It enables the exchange of ideas, holds power accountable, and allows for peaceful social change. I believe it deserves robust protection even when the speech is unpopular, offensive, or makes people uncomfortable. The marketplace of ideas works best when different viewpoints could be expressed and challenged through dialogue rather than suppression. However, this incident highlights the critical tension. While we must protect the right to express political views, we also need to grapple with how heated rhetoric and polarization can sometimes contribute to an environment where violence becomes more likely. The traditional legal limits on free speech, direct incitement to imminent lawless action, through threats, defamation, remain important guardrails. But I think we also need to consider our broader civic culture. How do we maintain space for vigorous political debate while also promoting norms that discourage dehumanization and encourage good faith engagement? What's your perspective on where those lines should be drawn? Do you think current legal protections for speech are adequate, or do we need different approaches to address political violence while preserving open discourse?
I think those are all important points, and those are the kinds of questions and the kinds of places that I'm interested in going. So, these last questions: how do we maintain space for vigorous political debate while also promoting norms that discourage dehumanization and encourage good faith engagement? It's a tough one, and I think in this case, what I believe fans the flames is you have something like social media and clickbait and other kinds of ideas like that, which are intended to amp up people's emotions, right? So I certainly don't feel like Charlie Kirk is innocent of this, but it absolutely does not validate or justify violence. And I think it is kind of in the world today, there aren't enough guardrails around how far we should be taking people's desires to put things up on social media just to get clicks and likes and subscribers. There's a whole culture, that's built around that now, and it does this. It's too early to say, but it does seem to lend some credence for us to really more seriously examine this, because there's a likelihood that it could get even worse. And this isn't the first time something like this has happened, and it won't be the last. Clearly, I mean, I think it is getting worse, and that's what's concerning me. But then again, like, how do you, if you want to maintain true freedom of speech, what are those guardrails? So Elon Musk, he literally bought Twitter, renamed it X. In part, we don't know what his true motivations are for purchasing Twitter, but in part because he felt that the previous leadership of Twitter was really policing and limiting people's abilities to say what they wanted to say uh, on the internet, and he wanted to kind of level the playing field. But at the same time, incitement of lawlessness and incitement of mob mentality and incitement of violence definitely can't be something that is protected under freedom of speech. I don't know. I don't have a good answer to the question that current legal protections for free speech are adequate. I think we are, because of technology, we're moving so fast laws aren't able to keep up with the way that the world is changing and the way and these new mediums that people now have access to in which to speak their mind. So I worry a lot about that. And we're too slow to kind of keep pace, and there's too much unregulated. Too many things are unregulated, uh, and it's questionable whether or not to what degree that regulation should step in and say, hey, you know what, we need to kind of we need to put some more eyes on this and protect people and protect emotions so that they don't get carried away and go in a direction of seeing what we saw today. I'm going to pause there, and I want to hear your response to that. Almost there. Okay. Here's the response.
You've identified a crucial paradox of our time. Technology has democratized speech in unprecedented ways, but it's also created new mechanisms that can amplify the most inflammatory content and potentially contribute to real-world harm. Your point about the clickbait economy is particularly important. Social media algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, and content that provokes strong emotional reactions, anger, outrage, fear, tends to get more clicks, shares, and comments. This creates perverse incentives where the most inflammatory voices could gain the largest platforms, not because their ideas have merit, but because they generate engagement. The challenge is that traditional First Amendment doctrine wasn't designed for this environment. The imminent lawless action standard from Brandenburg v. Ohio assumes a relatively direct causal chain. Someone gives a speech to a crowd that then immediately acts. But what do we do with content that gradually radicalizes people over time, or that contributes to a broader climate where violence becomes more thinkable? I think you're right that we're in a regulatory lag period. The law often takes decades to catch up to new technologies, and by then the damage may be done. But here's where I see the tension. If we give platforms or governments more power to determine what speech contributes to a climate of violence, don't we risk creating new forms of censorship that could be abused? Today it might be used against genuinely harmful content, but tomorrow it could be wielded against legitimate political dissent.
Yeah.
What's your take on that risk? Do you think there are ways to address the algorithmic amplification problem without opening the door to broader speech restrictions?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I mean, I think that is the danger. That is the big risk, which is just the way you said it. If we allow platforms and governments more power and enable them with the ability to regulate these kinds of things more, it's a double-edged sword, because there are times where they may do that which is genuinely for the betterment of society. But human beings being human beings, there's also a likelihood and a very real possibility that somebody will use that as a means of control and a means of suppressing genuine speech and genuine communication that ought to be protected and ought to be heard, particularly if it's coming at a point that is critical of something in the government or in the environment that really needs questioning. So part of what we like about freedom of speech is that it's a way of keeping everybody kind of accountable, and in particular a a large monolithic government. And every government, if it's centralized in the world today and contains several million people, has to be monolithic in some sense. In the United States, we refer to that as the federal government, even though we have state governments which are localized, and that's even further broken down into cities, towns, and counties. There's a localization, kind of quote unquote, going all the way to the lowest level. But then ultimately, everybody pays their federal taxes, right? There is a centralized government that everybody is also abiding by, again, in this country. So you don't want to give too much power to that central authority, because once you do give that power, the likelihood is you're never going to get it back. And at the same time, if the problem right now is that the power actually is in the corporation, because the corporate tech companies are the ones that own social media. They're the ones that are deciding what should and shouldn't be censored, and what should and shouldn't be guardrails. But they're companies, so their objectives are to optimize on shareholder wealth. And it's a strange place to be in, because a lot of that is publicly held. So we are the people. I mean, we're the ones that are shooting our own selves in the foot. If we own stock in a public company like Facebook or Meta, whatever you want to call them, or X, or Instagram, Meta. Meta basically is all of social. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is we want those companies to get wealthier, because if they get wealthy and we own their stock, we get wealthy. But at the same time, the way that they're going about trying to get wealthy is endangering us. So that's a little bit of a catch-22. And I think that is very problematic. So we kind of have our own selves to blame in some sense, because we know what these companies are doing. We know that in order to optimize engagement, the way that science and various other experiments and studies are showing that is by making people feel negative emotions, whether it's sad, depressed, angry, outraged, disgusted, shamed, guilty, whatever. Those things are the ones that optimize engagement and then transfer over into clicks, shares, and comments. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Yeah, so I don't have a good answer. I think the risks are very, very high. And I think in general, we just seem to be less emotionally mature to be able to handle differences of opinion. And I find that also very problematic and worrisome. And so I'm interested to hear what you have to say about that part of the equation. What do you think about the current emotional maturity of the world today, in various different demographics? I'm curious to hear your take on that. Almost processing. I'm adding a little bit extra. I'm telling it to take more time to give a detailed explanation. All right. Circular problem. There's system and social fabric. Yep. All right. Now let's listen to Claude's answers.
You've hit on something really profound here. This circular problem where we're simultaneously the victims and beneficiaries of a system that may be undermining our social fabric. It's a kind of collective action problem where individual rational choices, wanting our investments to grow, engaging with content that catches our attention, aggregate into outcomes that nobody actually wants. Regarding emotional maturity and our capacity to handle disagreement, I think you're observing something real and concerning. There seem to be several factors at play. First, we've lost many of the traditional social structures that used to give people practice in navigating disagreement constructively. Bowling leagues, church groups, union halls, neighborhood associations. These spaces where people with different political views still had to work together on concrete problems. Now our social sorting is much more complete. We can live in ideological bubbles in ways that previous generations couldn't. Second, the medium itself shapes the message. Social media strips away most of the contextual cues that help us interpret communication. Tone of voice, body language, shared physical space. It's much easier to dehumanize someone when they're just text on a screen. And the asynchronous nature means we can craft the perfect comeback without the immediate feedback that face-to-face conversation provides. But I think there's something deeper happening too. The sheer pace of information flow seems to be overwhelming our cognitive and emotional processing capabilities. We're evolutionarily designed to handle maybe 150 relationships and local, concrete problems. Now we're expected to have informed opinions about dozens of complex global issues, delivered to us in real-time fragments designed to provoke immediate emotional responses. This creates a kind of emotional hypervigilance where everything feels urgent and existential. When people feel constantly under threat, they're more likely to respond with the kind of tribal, black and white thinking that makes productive disagreement impossible. What do you think about that analysis? Do you see ways we might rebuild some of those social muscles for constructive disagreement?
Very interesting. I think some of what you're talking about here, i.e., the bowling leagues, the church groups, the union halls, the neighborhood associations, those are all, as I understand it, called third places. And I think there has been an erosion of third places over the last 15 to 20 years. As you've seen the decline of third places, you've seen this incline of social media and technology. It sounds, even when I say it, it sounds so hackneyed to keep bringing up social media, but I don't think there's any other way, unless I'm missing something. I don't see I do feel like it's a very powerful force, and it does seem to be taking on a very important role in shaping society, and more importantly, in shaping the emotional architecture or the emotional fabric of, you know, the populace, the intelligentsia. It seems to be so influential that it just can't be, it can't be ignored. But I guess part of what I'm wondering is am I over indexing? I guess that's what I'm trying to be careful of, is not to try and put so much emphasis on that. But it does seem to be that not just social media, but just the way the world is today, the influx of data does seem to be overwhelming. Human beings were not designed in that way. If you think about how were we functioning 100 years ago, it was completely different. 1925 versus 2025 is literally, they couldn't be more orthogonal to each other. They're completely different, and the stresses, there were definitely stresses in 1925, but I think the stresses that exist today, uh, just day to day living, I think feel to be significantly higher. And it does seem to feel like we don't know how to quite handle that. And it is too much. And we're not able to backtrack. Like, there isn't a way to kind of turn the clocks back or to somehow unwind how far we've gone. It does seem like some rebuilding of social muscles around constructive disagreement is very, very necessary. Uh, I just don't see it happening. How is that going to happen? What are the forces that are going to really enable that? I don't know. I just continue to see the erosion of third places, and there isn't something yet that's giving me a lot of optimism around replacing it or replenishing it. And it does seem, from a previous discussion, that technology is just helping us to be alone together, which isn't good. We need to be together, not alone together. So I'm interested to hear your thoughts and your response to that. And what do you think? What else could possibly, what are some other things that you feel could counter or replenish third places and work in opposition to, I guess what you could say is like the emotional atrophy that is taking place and the increasing discomfort around people having an opinion that's different from our own? I want you to give me a very long and detailed response that's thorough. Okay, almost there. Okay. All right, we have some interesting stuff coming up. A lot of things that are bolded, which I'm going to have to unbold. Okay, it's definitely a longer response. Okay. All right, almost ready. Okay, here we go. Copy paste. Here is the response.
You are absolutely not over-indexing on social media and technology. I think you are correctly identifying one of the defining forces of our era. The 1925 to 2025 comparison is stark and illuminating. In 1925, most people's daily information diet consisted of maybe a local newspaper, radio broadcasts, and conversations with people in their immediate physical community. Now we're consuming thousands of micro-fragments of information daily from across the globe, most designed to trigger immediate emotional responses. The alone together phenomenon you mention is particularly insightful. We have more ways to connect than ever before, but these connections are increasingly mediated, curated, and stripped of the messy, humanizing elements that build genuine empathy and understanding.
Just so you know, the alone together was something that Claude mentioned. That didn't come from me. So I want to give credit where credit is due.
We have more ways to connect than ever before, but these connections are increasingly mediated, curated, and stripped of the messy, humanizing elements that build genuine empathy and understanding. When you're in a bowling league with someone, you see them struggle with a split, celebrate small victories, deal with personal setbacks. You develop a three-dimensional understanding of them as a human being. That makes it much harder to completely demonize them when you discover they vote differently than you do. But I think there are some countervailing forces and potential solutions emerging, though they're still fragile and need intentional cultivation. Local governance renaissance. There's been a quiet resurgence of interest in hyperlocal politics. School boards, city councils, neighborhood planning committees. These spaces force people to work together on concrete, tangible problems regardless of their broader political affiliations. You might disagree with your neighbor about federal tax policy, but you both want the potholes fixed and the local park maintained. These shared concrete goals create space for relationship building across ideological lines. Makerspaces and community workshops. The growth of community makerspaces, repair cafes, community gardens, and tool libraries represents a kind of modern third place. These spaces bring people together around shared activities and learning rather than shared beliefs. There's something about working with your hands alongside others that seems to bypass some of our more tribal cognitive patterns. Crisis-driven community building. Paradoxically, local crises often reveal our capacity for cooperation. During natural disasters, power outages, or community emergencies, people often rediscover their ability to work together across difference. The challenge is maintaining those connections when the immediate crisis passes. Intentional cross-cutting experiences. Some communities are experimenting with deliberate bridge building, programs that bring together people from different political backgrounds around shared activities like hiking groups, book clubs focused on historical rather than contemporary topics, or volunteer work. The key seems to be finding shared experiences that don't immediately trigger political identities. Economic cooperation models. The growth of community-supported agriculture, local currency systems, time banks, and cooperative businesses creates interdependencies that transcend political divisions. When your economic well-being is tied to your neighbors in concrete ways, it becomes much harder to maintain purely adversarial relationships. But here's what I think is crucial. These solutions require what we might call social entrepreneurship. people who are willing to be intentional about community building in ways that previous generations might not have needed to be. In 1925, many third places emerged organically from economic and social necessities. Now we have to be much more deliberate about creating them. The emotional regulation piece is equally important. I think we need to develop what we might call information hygiene practices, deliberate strategies for managing our information consumption in ways that preserve our capacity for nuanced thinking. This might include things like slow news movements, deliberate breaks from social media, meditation practices, or even just old-fashioned habits like taking walks without phones. We also need to rebuild our tolerance for discomfort and uncertainty. Much of our current polarization stems from what psychologists call need for closure, the desire to resolve ambiguity quickly rather than sitting with complexity. But most important issues are genuinely complex and don't have simple answers. Learning to be comfortable with, I don't know, or it's complicated is a crucial skill that our current information environment actively undermines. Educational systems have a role here too. We need to teach media literacy, but more than that, we need to teach emotional regulation, perspective taking, and what we might call cognitive humility, the recognition that our own perceptions are limited and fallible. The challenge is that all of these solutions require collective action and long-term thinking in an environment that rewards individual optimization and immediate gratification.
Right.
It's a classic coordination problem. But I do think there are signs of people recognizing the costs of our current trajectory and beginning to experiment with alternatives. What gives me some hope is that humans are remarkably adaptable. We've navigated major technological and social transitions before. The printing press, industrialization, urbanization, each created new challenges that required new social innovations. We're in the middle of figuring out how to adapt to our current technological moment, and it's messy and painful, but I don't think it's hopeless. What's your sense of whether people in your community are hungry for these kinds of alternatives? Do you see signs of people wanting more genuine connection and constructive dialogue, even if they don't know how to create it?
So a lot of detail there and info, which is what I asked for. But I think probably the thing that stuck out to me the most was um, the information hygiene practices. I think that's a good idea. Deliberate strategies for managing how we actually take in news and information, and being intentional about that, so that it doesn't force us into a bubble and it doesn't reduce our capacity to hear another side. I mean, I'm definitely guilty of this. I mean, there's certain things that you're just not going to. Some of it is based on a person's values and beliefs, right? I mean, if some of this emotional regulation isn't going to come down to, well, I think stealing is okay and I think it isn't. It's not, it shouldn't be, I think, but those are gray areas, right? So for some people, they may view a political idea in that fashion. I mean, they may put it on the same level. Well, to me, this is just like saying it's okay to steal or it's not okay to steal. I'm using stealing as an example because I think it can be probably universally accepted that that's a bad thing. And I'm kind of appealing to Immanuel Kant and the categorical imperative as an absolute. If everybody stole, that would not be a situation that would be conducive to kind of like living in a community or in a society. We would all be, trying to protect our stuff, and everything would kind of be in upheaval. So who's to say you can't dictate what people's values ought to be if they're looking at a particular topic or subject and they're putting it on the same level as stealing or not stealing, it is going to have kind of that implicit charge. And for them, it may be very, very important. And for you, it may not be. So that is something that I think is challenging. Long-term thinking. I think that the other point about this idea of need for closure, and that that's what we want. That's what our minds want naturally. And it's extremely uncomfortable for certain problems to remain open-ended, and not have a solution, either because we don't know it or because the problem itself is very difficult with a lot of complexities to it, and it's not clear that there's a solution that's going to resolve that problem in its entirety and for all people. So that's uncomfortable to deal with and to bear. I do think that one of the challenges with what's being proposed is there ironically there is a willingness. We do notice, particularly from a previous discussion around the loneliness epidemic, people do feel more lonely and they want connection, but at the same time they're not willing. They want connection, but they don't want to give. They want to receive. And I remember going to a talk around community. And I think one of the things that I learned, which was significant, is if you're looking for a community, ironically, the best way to go about doing that is by thinking about what it is you can give. How can you give? And to what extent and to what degree are you willing to give? Because it's only through giving that you actually will get. And even though a person that's lonely, what their immediate need is for that loneliness to be satisfied, but ironically, that's not what they should be going out and seeking out and expecting first. What they should be thinking and expecting is how they can give more of themselves. But that's very counterintuitive, because when you're in a state of loneliness, you're largely thinking about yourself and what it is, and just being in a mode or in a mindset of receiving and getting, and constantly going out and searching for someone or something to give to you. And only when you get are you then going to be willing to give. And I think that is a dangerous mindset, because you could be searching for a long time to get something, and what you really should have been doing was trying to give. And you may never get. You may never run into that feeling of getting, because that's all you're focusing on, and you're missing actually the way energetically you should be approaching this. So it's a bit of a conundrum. yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts around that. Transferring, it's almost there. I spoke a lot. Claude is gonna then respond to what I said. There we go. Oh, wow. Yeah, okay. So Claude is processing and outputting its answer, and then I'm going to transfer that over. Oh, I didn't expect Claude to. Okay, it's giving a pretty significant answer. Okay, that's not bad. Let's see what it has to say. All right, here we go.
You've touched on something profound about the paradox of connection, that the very act of seeking it can become self-defeating if we're approaching it from a mindset of scarcity rather than abundance. The giving first principle you learned about is psychologically sound and cuts to the heart of why so many modern attempts at community building fail. When someone is lonely and desperately seeking connection, they often radiate that neediness in ways that actually repel others. There's an almost transactional quality to it. What can you do for my loneliness? That makes authentic relationship impossible. But when someone shows up asking, how can I be useful here? What does this community need that I might be able to provide? That energy is magnetic. It signals that you see others as full human beings rather than potential solutions to your personal problem. This connects directly to why third places work when they do. The bowling league isn't primarily about socializing, it's about bowling. The community garden isn't mainly about friendship, it's about growing food. People come together around shared purpose, and relationship becomes a byproduct rather than the primary goal.
Right.
When connection is the natural result of working alongside others rather than the explicit objective, it feels more authentic and sustainable. Your point about moral foundations is crucial and gets at why, just talk to each other, solutions often fail. When someone genuinely believes that a political position is equivalent to endorsing theft, a fundamental violation of social order, asking them to approach it with detached intellectual curiosity is asking them to suppress what feels like moral emergency. The categorical imperative framework you mentioned is useful here because it highlights how certain beliefs feel like universal principles rather than preferences. But here's what's interesting. Even people with very different moral foundations often share more common ground than they realize when you move away from abstract political labels toward concrete local problems. The person who thinks universal healthcare is theft and the person who thinks opposing it is murder might both agree that the local clinic needs better funding, or that prescription drug costs are too high, or that preventive care reduces emergency room visits. The information hygiene piece becomes critical here because our current media environment is specifically designed to highlight the most emotionally charged abstract differences while obscuring practical common ground. A steady diet of national political content trains us to see every local issue through the lens of grand ideological conflict. I think effective information hygiene might include things like deliberately seeking out local news over national political coverage, reading law-informed journalism rather than social media hot takes, consuming content that shows people working together rather than fighting, and maybe most importantly, taking regular breaks from consuming any news at all. The discomfort with ambiguity you mentioned is so important. Our brains are pattern recognition machines that want to categorize quickly and move on. But the most important problems, how to balance individual freedom with collective responsibility, how to address inequality without stifling innovation, how to preserve tradition while adapting to change. These don't have clean solutions. They require ongoing negotiation and continuous recalibration. Learning to sit with that discomfort without rushing to premature closure is almost like a spiritual practice. It requires a kind of intellectual humility that says, this is complex and I might be wrong. which is the opposite of what social media algorithms reward. Do you think there's a way to make this kind of nuance, humble engagement more socially rewarded? Right now, the loudest, most confident voices tend to get the most attention, even when they're wrong.
Excellent points. To answer the final question, do I think there's a way to make a kind of nuanced, humble engagement more socially rewarded? I don't think so. Not the way things are right now. The loudest, most confident voices, unfortunately, are the ones that are elevated. And unless there's something that's going to kind of, to circle back, I was just going to say, unless there's something that is regulating that, but then that gets to the heart of what this conversation was all about, which is free speech. We don't want to inhibit that. That's what I find is kind of the limiting factor. We have freedom of speech as a liberty and a value and a belief that really is kind of at the base, at the foundation of what we love about America, about the United States. It really has become one of those things that we hold high and we're really proud of. But we are seeing that it's has these consequences to it. Even the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, we're seeing obviously some challenges with that. So there aren't clean solutions. Just like we were saying, these things are complex. We hold these values high, the freedom and the liberty to express yourself unimpinged, unhindered, unregulated, and at the same time, it has these consequences that come with it, and these dangers and these pitfalls. And it's not. I don't think there's a way where you can really have one without the other, and that I think is a truism of what some of these values entail. And I do want to kind of go back to this other point that was made about I loved this point that you were making about third places where, people don't go bowling, primarily for the socializing. It's for the bowling, and people don't go and participate in a community garden because they want to make a friend. They go because they want to grow food, or they want to grow flowers or whatever. And I completely agree. I think that's probably the biggest thing that people miss, is that the relationship, the connection often comes as a byproduct of a shared purpose around a primary goal. And I think a lot of people miss that. They kind of, or misunderstand that, and they're just looking for the connection, but they don't have a clear idea about what is a shared purpose that they want to have with other people. And I definitely believe that, working alongside others, having connection coming as a result of that feels more authentic and more sustainable, rather than that being the end in itself. So I really like that point, and I really do feel like that is that is why I think a lot of people remain lonely and disconnected and therefore misunderstand each other, because there is a lot of lost understanding of shared purpose or unwillingness to participate in a shared purpose. They just kind of want to skip that step and just go straight to the connection and just have connection magically appear. But that's not how it works. You can't have a flower without a stem, and that's what people want. They just want that flower bud, and yeah, they don't just kind of grow out of thin air without something underneath it. That's the root. That's the grounding. That's the real. The stem and the roots are the real reason why the flower is possible, not the other way around. So I find that pretty interesting and pretty profound, and I think that's definitely a good thing for me to keep in mind, because I think about that too, particularly with, and I like these questions too. How can I be useful here? What does this community need that I might be able to provide? I am guilty of not thinking that way, and I really want to reverse that and make that a primary focus. So I think those points are very helpful and things that I'm going to keep in mind. I'm going to close this out pretty soon. So I want you to give me your closing thoughts, in response to what I just said, and also to this conversation as a whole, around freedom of speech and um, connection and tolerance and emotional maturity, all of those things. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. And this will conclude once we get it. Eric just joined. I don't know if he's still there, though. I don't think he is. Yeah, he jumped in and jumped out. That's okay. All right, here we go. Claude's thinking. Okay, so this is a good summary. I think this is going to be a good kind of way to wrap things up.
Your flower and stem metaphor beautifully captures something essential about human connection that our culture has largely forgotten. We've become so focused on the outcome, the beautiful bloom of friendship and community, that we've neglected the unglamorous but necessary infrastructure that makes it possible. The stem of shared purpose, the roots of mutual service and contribution. This conversation has crystallized for me how many of our current challenges stem from wanting the benefits of our values without accepting their inherent tensions. Freedom of speech is messy and sometimes dangerous, but the alternative, someone deciding what ideas are too risky to express, is historically far more dangerous.
Completely
The
agree.
right to bear arms creates tragic possibilities, but so does concentrating all force in the hands of the state. These aren't bugs in the system, they're features that come with the territory of free societies. What strikes me most is how the erosion of third places has made us forget that democracy was never supposed to be primarily about grand ideological battles fought in abstract spaces. It was supposed to be about neighbors figuring out how to live together, solve concrete problems, and build something better than any of them could create alone.
Right.
When that muscle memory is strong, people can disagree about big philosophical questions while still maintaining their fundamental humanity toward each other. The tragedy of Charlie Kirk's death illustrates how we lost that capacity. Instead of seeing political opponents as fellow citizens with different ideas about how to solve shared problems, we increasingly see them as existential threats to be defeated rather than neighbors to be understood. When disagreement becomes warfare, violence becomes more thinkable. But your insight about approaching community through service rather than need gives me hope. When we show up as Cain, how can I be useful? Rather than, how can I be fulfilled? We create the conditions where genuine understanding becomes possible. We see each other as complex human beings rather than representatives of threatening ideologies. The information hygiene practices we discussed aren't just about managing data overload. They're about preserving our capacity to see nuance, to sit with complexity, to remain curious rather than certain. In a world that rewards the loudest and most confident voices, choosing humility and patience is almost a radical act. Maybe that's where we start, not by trying to fix the entire system, but by modeling the kind of engagement we want to see. Being the person who asks good questions rather than provides easy answers,
Right.
who seeks to understand before being understood, who shows up to give rather than to get. The path forward isn't about finding perfect solutions to these fundamental tensions, but about learning to navigate them with wisdom and grace. That work begins with each of us, in our own communities, one conversation and one act of service at a time. Thank you for such a thoughtful exploration of these difficult questions. Conversations like this one, nuanced, patient, willing to sit with complexity, are exactly what our democracy needs more of.
Yeah, completely agree. Um, yeah, I think it. Claude did a great job of kind of capturing and summarizing. It's a robot, so it better be. Um, yeah, man, I'm just I can't say I'm a fan of Charlie Kirk's, but my God, like I think this point about if you it doesn't matter, nothing matters if you lose the ability to see somebody else's humanity and that person just becomes demonized and therefore violence is sanctioned. I'll never agree to that. Never. I mean, that there's no way one can ever justify words translating into violence as a justification for actions. It cannot. I might disagree with somebody, and it may infuriate me, but there's no way that it could ever justify taking a violent action to silence that other person because you don't want them to say what they're saying, you don't want them to believe what they're believing, and you're feeling threatened by that or upset or angered. It's complicated. It's very complicated, and I worry. I am generally worried. I do think that something like this can really be a significant inflection point, where we've gone from being able to have debates as a society to, being too scared to really speak our mind because we fear for our lives. That's and especially when it's tied up into politics, very dangerous, very scary, and very unpredictable and volatile. I think that's the other thing that I am sitting with and worried about. There's definitely a big unpredictable factor that is coming in here, and time will tell. But yeah, I thought it was important to have a conversation like this, even if it's with a robot. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to close out for today. So thanks for everyone, or Eric, I don't know if you're still on, for joining. I appreciate it.